Okay, hi, Year 12. Sorry, I've not been in touch for a bit. I'm going to be giving you a few bits of work to do this week before we start to go back into school in a week or so. We'll talk about that a little bit at the end. Okay, so I'm going to give you a quick overview today of the Second Civil War. Okay, um, now where I want to get up to by the end of this half term is just up until the Restoration. So that means we've got five more chapters we're going to try and do. This is the first of them. Okay. I've attached and shown my homework, this knowledge organizer. You might find it useful to print it off just to have in front of you while we're going through the lecture. So you've got timeline, key people, key dates, and then this is the difference between Presbyterians and independents, which is one of the key causes of the Civil War, Second Civil War. Okay, so Second Civil War in 1648. So let's just start it off. I'll try and do this as quickly as possible. So before we get into the Second Civil War, we've got to remember where we left off in 1646 at the end of the First Civil War. Okay, so we saw that Charles had been defeated by an alliance of Parliament and the Scottish Covenanters. So particularly after the creation of the New Model Army in 1645, Parliament was able to decisively crush Charles. By 1646, surrendered himself to the Scots before they then handed him over to Parliament. But as we also saw last time, that Charles hadn't been completely defeated because he knew that as part of the ancient constitution, he would have to play some kind of role in any kind of settlements. Remember, the ancient constitution being the balance between the king, the House of Lords, and the House of Commons. So Charles knew that there was no sort of serious strand of opinion at this point at the end of the First Civil War that envisaged a future without a king. So because of that, he knew that he had some leverage, okay, because he knew that he would have to play a part in any kind of settlement that would be seen as acceptable or realistic at that time. So what he tried to do was play for time. Okay, so he begins negotiations with Parliament while he's under house arrest, and what he's hoping to do is to draw them out for as long as possible to exacerbate, make worse divisions within the opposition. Okay, because at the end of the First Civil War, divisions did really begin to open up amongst the coalition who defeated Charles, and particularly there were three main blocks at the end of the First Civil War that we can probably draw out. So there was Parliament itself, the New Model Army, and then the Scottish Covenanters. Okay, so those are three overlapping but distinct groups. And once the common enemy of Charles disappears, the differences between them begin to emerge. Okay. And one of the reasons for that is we go back to that Keith Wrightson quote we looked at last time, is that the Civil War meant different things to different people. So we saw, even just in England, without taking the Scottish Covenanters into account, okay, in terms of the reasons why people fought for Parliament, okay, so some people did it because they thought they were defending the ancient constitution, so that's why they rode into battle saying king and Parliament rather than Parliament instead of the king. They weren't anti-monarchy. They just wanted to restore the balance of the ancient constitution. Some of them thought they were fighting a religious war against popish innovation and hoping to complete the Reformation, so that kind of more puritanical religious aspect. But one key thing about the war was that, as Wrightson says here as well, the war itself raised expectations and new demands. Okay, so although these were kind of like the core reasons why the MPs, especially who fought for Parliament, decided to fight the Civil War, the war itself was a kind of radicalizing event which led to people having more ambitious demands and new demands. So what people were fighting for was really different depending on who you asked, and that was one of the reasons why the divisions became so profound once the common enemy of Charles had been taken out of the equation. And particularly lots of parliamentarians who fought against Charles were actually becoming really concerned by the kind of forces that the First Civil War had unleashed. They were worried that the traditional political nation were under threat, and society's natural order and hierarchy were at risk of being undermined. So remember that idea of the great chain of being, right? People being born into a very strict hierarchy, put in that place by God, that idea which emerged from medieval times. Most people who were parliamentarians believed in that idea, but they obviously thought that the Civil War was a sort of war amongst the elite. Okay, it was a sort of war between people who supported absolutist monarchy, who were part of the political nation, and then the people who wanted there to be a partnership between the Parliament and the King, who were also part of the traditional political nation. But what kind of happened during the Civil War is forces from below that top part of the elite became involved, and it meant that lots of people who originally fought for Parliament almost had a bit of buyer's remorse. They were quite concerned by the forces that had been unleashed by the war that they'd agreed to fight. Now, there's sort of three reasons we'll quickly go through for that growing radicalization within the parliamentary side. So the first one we touched on last time was the creation of the New Model Army. Now, remember, the point about the New Model Army is that it was made up of the most sort of religiously and politically committed soldiers. So it wasn't just like a mercenary army. It was an army of highly disciplined, usually very religiously motivated soldiers. And within the army itself, the ideas of the religious independence, the religious radicals became quite important. When the army wasn't actually in battle, it would be sitting around, and you'd have these ordinary soldiers who were quite often from outside the sort of ranks of the normal political nation, sitting around debating, ideas about religion and politics. And that kind of radicalized a lot of them. A lot of them developed their own ideas about what kind of society they wanted and what kind of religion they wanted the war to result in and what the war was actually fought for. The other reason why the New Model Army was quite destabilizing is it was meritocratic. So remember, the idea of meritocracy is being promoted based upon your ability rather than because of who your father is, the sort of title you were born with. And obviously, if you were kind of a traditionalist who believed in the idea of the great chain of being, that was quite a threatening idea, right? It seemed to be destabilizing one of the key features of early modern society. And we saw that famous quote from Cromwell where he said, "I had rather have a plain russet-coated captain that knows what he fights for and loves what he knows than that you call a gentleman and is nothing else." Remember Cromwell implying there that he'd rather have soldiers who knew what they were fighting for, even if they were from humble backgrounds, rather than gentlemen who, didn't know what they were fighting for and didn't have the kind of commitment he was looking for. The other sort of reason for growing radicalism within the army and some sections of parliament was the growth of religious radicalism. So we saw that during the Civil War itself, the fact that Parliament won and defeated the king kind of emboldened religious radicals. Remember, that was that Calvinist idea we talked about belief in divine providence, right? The idea that God was guiding everything, and that therefore, if you were winning, it showed that God favored you and your cause. So that made a lot of them quite radical and quite bold, that sense that God was fighting on their side. And that was also combined with the fact that during the Civil War, remember, censorship had broken down. So the state was no longer able to censor effectively radical works that before the Civil War would have landed people in jail. We saw during the actual Civil War itself, 1,000 pamphlets a year, are being published. And also because of the collapse in sort of church discipline, the fact that the religious courts aren't prosecuting religious dissidents anymore like they were during Charles's years of personal rule, you have the growth, particularly in London and other major urban areas, of independent churches, right? So remember, these churches which weren't under the control of the Church of England, who developed quite heterodox ideas, different religiously radical ideas about how churches and society should be run. And that kind of provoked the backlash. Okay, lots of people who became political Presbyterians, who we'll look at in a minute, they were really concerned by this outbreak of, free writing and religious radicalism. And one of the reasons they supported a Presbyterian settlement in England was that in the Presbyterian church, there wouldn't have been any religious toleration. So these independent churches would have been shut down. And again, if you were mainly concerned about the growth of radical ideas that challenged hierarchy, that would obviously be very appealing. And the radicals within the army obviously drew their support from these same groups. So that's why they became known as independents, because they got a lot of their support from independent churches, right? These churches that were independent of Church of England control. And they became resultingly, as Cromwell put it, concerned with liberty for tender consciences. Okay, so ideas of religious liberty become very popular within the New Model Army, but are obviously completely shocking to people from the sort of more traditional part of the parliamentary cause. And the final thing that kind of leads to divisions is that these religious radicals, known as the Independents, they were very opposed to Scottish Presbyterianism for the reasons I just kind of outlined. So, in the Scottish Presbyterian Church, although it was modelled upon a more purely Calvinist Protestant church that the Puritans before the Civil War would have approved of, the key thing was that it wasn't religiously tolerant, right? Everyone had to be a strict Calvinist, and there was very little toleration for anything outside of that. Now, if you remember, we saw that during the Civil War, um, the way that Parliament had negotiated the entry of the Covenanters into the Civil War on their side was through that agreement, the Solemn League and Covenant. And if you remember, in that deal, Parliament basically agreed that they would accept a Presbyterian church in England in exchange for the Scots support. So when the religious independence and New Model Army start talking about religious liberty and liberty for tender consciences, the Scottish Presbyterians are furious because they feel like this is a betrayal of the basically the agreement they'd made with Parliament under John Pym that they would bring in a Scottish Presbyterian church in exchange for their support. But for the independents, they pointed out the exact wording of the treaty was that England would bring in church reform according to the word of God and the example of the best reformed churches. Now, the Scottish Presbyterians obviously took the wording the best reformed churches as examples to mean modelling it on the Scottish Presbyterian Church. But for people like Cromwell, they were seriously allergic to the kind of authoritarianism of the Scottish Presbyterian Church. He didn't believe in the kind of religious uniformity they wanted. He wanted a very broad, tolerant Protestant church that could encompass lots of views, including those of the religious radicals in the independent churches. So that was a major cause of tension between New Model Army and the Scottish Presbyterians, the disagreements over bringing this agreement into England. Now, just this extract quickly, I think is quite good by Robert Ashton talking about the origins of the Second Civil War, which kind of ties all that together. Is he says those parliamentarians who had gone to war in 1642 certainly would reject any suggestion that their growing sense of alienation from the parliamentary government was due to changes of attitude on their own part. No, it was not they, but the rest of the world that had changed. They now saw both king and parliament threatened by alarmingly revolutionary forces thrown up by the First Civil War, but not disappearing with its conclusion. In turn, the New Model Army was itself perceived as offering a potent threat to the authority of both parliament and the monarchy itself. What could be more natural than that, as twin focuses of radical and sectarian attack, these two institutions should be drawn closer together? So a couple of things just to sort of draw out there. It's that going back to that Wrightson idea about increased expectations. So the parliamentarians who started to turn on the New Model Army, they wouldn't say they were the problem, betraying the cause. They would say, well, no, the problem was that the world itself had changed. They were more concerned by the revolutionary forces thrown up by the Civil War than they were by Charles at that point. And that's why these two institutions should be drawn together. So this is talking about the fact of how some MPs actually began to see Charles as an ally and the New Model Army and the religious independents as the main threat, because obviously in both cases they saw the New Model Army and the religious radicals as a major threat to the traditional social hierarchy. But again, it's not because they changed, it's because the demands of the parliamentary opposition began to change because of this radicalizing influence of the army and a minority of independent MPs. Now, the main division then that opens up in England amongst the non-royalists is between the people who become known as political Presbyterians and political independents. Now, I went through that very, very briefly just a moment ago, talking about the causes of radicalization, but this little table you've got on your knowledge organizer, I'm not going to go through the whole thing in detail, but a couple of things I want to highlight. So what you've got here are the key differences between the political Presbyterians and the political independents. So this is in terms of their attitude towards the church, their attitude towards politics, their attitudes towards negotiations with the king, and then finally where their main bases of support were. Now, the differences in their attitude towards the church we've kind of gone through already. The political Presbyterians wanted a uniform authoritarian church model on the Scottish Presbyterian model, where there would be no religious toleration. The Independents disliked the authoritarianism of the Scottish Presbyterian Church, and they wanted to have a very high level of religious toleration. So they wanted religious liberty to a much larger extent. Politically, the Presbyterians would be seen as more moderate or conservative. Lots of them had been part of the Peace Party in the First Civil War, who'd cautioned against too aggressive a strategy to defeat Charles and force terms on him. A lot of the independents, people like Cromwell or Henry Ireton, they were more radical politically, and a lot of them had been part of the War Party in the Civil War. So the ones who pushed for the creation of the new model army and then the crushing of Charles and the forcing of political terms on him. They also had very different attitudes towards negotiations with Charles. The political Presbyterians essentially came to see, the new model army as more of a threat than Charles, and that was one of the reasons why they were offering Charles very generous terms, including disbanding the new model army before negotiations had been concluded. Because again, they weren't so worried about Charles backstabbing them as worrying about the threat the new model army posed to Parliament's power and authority. The independents, on the other hand, they saw the presence of the army as a key bargaining chip against Charles. So they agreed at some point the new model army would have to be demobilized and cut down significantly, but they didn't think that should happen until Charles had been forced to make major concessions that limited his power, because again, they saw Charles as a bigger threat than obviously themselves, the army. So that was a key difference in their tactic in terms of negotiations. Now, in terms of where their support bases lay, the political Presbyterians are the majority of MPs. So there are a minority of independent supporting MPs in Parliament. The majority are what we would think of as conservative political Presbyterians. Most of the sort of old traditional political nation, so the sort of higher gentry and the people who would have run local government would have been considered political Presbyterians. Obviously, they had the support of the Scottish Presbyterians in Scotland, and they would have had the support of the remnants of the established Church of England on their side as well, who were obviously much more concerned about, the religious radicals than they were about, changing the Anglican Church into a Scottish Presbyterian one. Now, in terms of where the main base of support of the independents lay, so they had a minority of MPs in Parliament, including Cromwell, most importantly. They had a lot of support in big urban areas like London amongst groups from outside the normal traditional political nation, so people who are artisans or traders or skilled craftsmen. A lot of them would have been New Model Army and Puritan supporters who would have supported their cause. Their biggest base of support, though, was in the New Model Army. That was where they were strongest. Okay, so they had a minority of MPs inside Parliament, but the biggest support came from the New Model Army itself. And then, obviously, in terms of church support, it was these independent Congregationalist churches, particularly based in London, but also in one or two other major urban areas. So that was roughly the division in terms of where their bases of support lay. Now, when the Civil War finishes, then, the political Presbyterians are obviously in charge of Parliament, particularly Denzil Hollis, okay, who was considered the main leader in Parliament at this time. Now, in terms of going back to that idea about, the MPs not changing, but the world changing around them, Holles is actually a very good example, because Holles was actually, do you remember the Five Members coup when Charles tried to arrest the five leading sort of radical MPs that he saw as responsible for creating the unrest against him? Denzil Hollis was actually one of those five MPs. So it shows you how far the Civil War had changed people's expectations and demands, that Holles was now considered a conservative within the parliamentary faction. But from Holles' point of view, he would say, well, I've been consistent. All that's changed is that, the army and this minority of MPs have become much more radical than the cause was originally supposed to be. Anyway, so Holles is in charge of this parliamentary majority of MPs who wants to negotiate a moderate settlement with Charles. Key context for that is obviously the country is war-weary, so the Civil War went on for nearly 4 years. And particularly in the sort of political nation, there was real resentment at the heavy taxation which had been required to pay for the army. So you remember the parliamentary committees had created these assessments in every county in England to pay for the army. And this was essentially a way of raising a permanent income tax to pay for the army, which was something that people weren't used to and had become resentful of. So they were very determined to demobilize the army as soon as possible and create a moderate settlement with Charles. Now, their first attempt to do this is they offer Charles very, very moderate terms. Okay, so Charles would have to agree to Presbyterianism in England for 3 years. Okay, to honour, the agreement that the parliamentarians had made with the Scottish Covenanters. The militia, so the army, would remain under the control of Parliament for 20 years. Charles would have to accept that the control of the armed forces would not pass to him for 20 years. He also had to agree to the Triennial Act, being a permanent part of English law, so meaning that Parliament would have to be called every 3 years, so you wouldn't get a recurrence of personal rule like you had in the 1630s. And also, all but 58 of the leading royalists would be pardoned. So again, very, very generous in terms of the majority of the royalists would not face any kind of charges or imprisonment for their actions during the First Civil War. But as we've seen already, Charles drew out these negotiations. He played for time to try and increase the divisions that he recognised were emerging between the majority of MPs in Parliament and the New Model Army in particular. So he tries to draw out these negotiations over the propositions to try and create greater and greater divisions within the opposition. Now, it got to the point at the beginning of 1647 where the political Presbyterians watered down their demands to make them even more lenient. And many in the army began to fear that they were giving too much away to Charles. And particularly, they agreed that before negotiations were concluded, they would do two things. They would demobilize the army, so the New Model Army would be basically disbanded, minus a very small force who would be selected to go and reconquer Ireland, and then a new safe army would be created based upon the London Train Band, so a less ideologically and politically committed army. And the New Model Army recognised this for what this was. They saw it as a kind of counter-revolution. Okay, so this was Parliament basically being freaked out at the growing power of the New Model Army and demobilising them, even at the cost of giving Charles a greater bargaining position. And it had the effect of politicising the army. Now, the word politicised is very important. So if we talk about the army becoming politicised, normally, obviously, the idea of an army is they take their orders from the government. Okay, so they're like almost an instrument. They don't make their own political decisions, right? They're an instrument of the authorities. So in the case of the New Model Army, they were meant to take their orders from Parliament. They were meant to be subordinate to it. But what starts to happen after the political Presbyterians agree to these really diluted settlement terms, and to when they start going after the New Model Army and calling for its disbanding, it politicised the army. They were no longer willing just to take the orders of Parliament, but they actually started to develop their own political ideas and their own political agenda, which obviously completely freaked out the majority of the political Presbyterians in Parliament. Now, what the army then started to do in March 1647 is they start writing petitions to the Parliament protesting their demobilisation. In response, Holles writes a document that becomes known as the Declaration of Dislike, where he infamously labels the New Model Army petitioners as enemies to the state and disturbers of the public peace. So he is accusing the New Model Army, because it is becoming politicised, of acting like an enemy of the state and a disturber of the public peace. But those comments by Holles and the negative reaction of the political Presbyterians has the effect of radicalizing the army even further. Okay, they become furious at this accusation that they are enemies of the state and disturbers of the peace. Now, as the New Model Army becomes politicized, Cromwell becomes more important. Now, the reason for that is Fairfax was actually in charge of the New Model Army, and Cromwell was his second in command in charge of the Czech cavalry. But Fairfax wasn't actually really that politically minded. He was more of a soldier. So as the army increasingly took on a more and more political role, Cromwell, who had much stronger religious and political opinions and was much more of a politician, he was actually an MP, he became much more important than Fairfax. Fairfax sort of fades into the background at this point compared to Cromwell. Also, Henry Ireton who becomes like one of Cromwell's key major generals later on, and he's also his son-in-law. And Ireton, in lots of ways, is the real political brains of the operation. So, as well as being Cromwell's son-in-law, he's the one who kind of writes the army's key political theory ideas. So, he's kind of like the political theorist, and Cromwell is the politician, as it were. Now, when the army began to become politicized, their initial demands are actually mostly sort of economic ones in some ways. The first key thing is that the Parliament owed the army a huge amount of back pay. So the soldiers hadn't been paid in many cases for months and months and months, and in some cases years. And one reason they were so angry at the attempt of Parliament to demobilize the army was that they were trying to do it so that they didn't have to pay the soldiers back all this money that they owed. The other key thing that they were really concerned about was that they said they would refuse to demobilize and disband until Parliament passed what was called an Indemnity Act. Now, an Indemnity Act basically would have pardoned soldiers for any crimes that were committed during the war, and many of the New Model Army were unwilling to demobilize until that had been passed. So initially they had this demand, they want their back pay to be paid before they demobilize, and they also want this Indemnity Act pardoning them passed before they will demobilize. But as time goes on, though, although it starts off with these quite narrow economic and political demands, they develop actually much stronger religious and political ideas of their own as well. Now, on the 25th of May, 1647, Charles can kind of see that the New Model Army is gaining ascendancy, and he begins to try and compromise a little bit more. So he agrees to a lot of the key points of the Newcastle propositions, but Parliament agree in exchange that Charles will only have to cede control of the army for 3 years rather than the 20 they asked for. And obviously for the army, this was way too lenient, and they weren't really going to tolerate it. But also as a gesture of goodwill, Parliament then vote on the 25th of May that from that moment they're going to disband the New Model Army, and they're only going to pay them back 8 weeks of the pay that they owe them, which again sort of is a lightning rod for the New Model Army. Now, how did the New Model Army respond to these lenient terms being offered to Charles, and then the Parliament calling for them basically to be demobilised before the negotiations were complete? Now, the first thing that they do is that they call this important what's called a rendezvous at Newmarket. So the rendezvous is obviously just a meeting point where the different groups meet up. So all the branches of the New Model Army meet up at Newmarket. It's a really, really important event. They decide to create a formal structure of representation known as the General Council of the Army, where they're going to decide what the Army's response to these calls from Parliament are going to be. And the thing that's really quite revolutionary about the General Council of the Army is it is made up of senior army commanders like Thomas Fairfax and Cromwell and Ireton. But the other thing which made it quite unique is that the New Model Army elected ordinary representatives from the lowest ranks called agitators. So each regiment at the army was allowed to elect 2 agitators who would represent them at the General Army Council. So it's almost this experiment in kind of revolutionary democracy. So the General Council of the Army then meet the senior commanders and these ordinary rank and file soldiers represented by the agitators to decide what they're going to do. And the rank and file agitators really begin to take control of the situation. And the most radical thing that they do, really, really important turning point, is a week after this call by Parliament to disband the army without paying them their back pay, is a week later on the 2nd of June. There's a very, very famous moment where Cornet Joyce, who is a cavalry soldier, takes Charles into army custody. Now, this moment is really famous because Cornet is not a name, it's a title. So a Cornet in the army was pretty much the lowest rank within the New Model Army's cavalry. And there's this very famous moment where Cornet Joyce turns up to arrest Charles. And Charles basically is completely shocked by this. And he says, where is your commission, sir? Which is, the kind of orders from the top of Parliament or the top of the army that would allow a lower ranked soldier like Joyce to speak to him. And when Joyce is asked for his commission, he pulls out his pistol and gestures to all the soldiers outside waiting for Charles and says, "That's my commission." And the reason it's a really famous sort of moment is it's that kind of world turned upside down idea that Charles is taken into custody by this ordinary soldier in the New Model Army. And for, supporters of the traditional order, this is everything they sort of were horrified could happen, right? That the lower orders were not taking orders anymore. And it sort of illustrated that idea that the traditional hierarchies of society were being challenged by the New Model Army. Now, what then happens is that, so the New Model Army take Charles into their custody as a way of having a bargaining chip, basically, against Parliament, right? So if Charles is under army custody, that is obviously going to increase their bargaining position significantly. And from June to July, the army starts to develop their own program of demands, right? So scrapping the Newcastle propositions, the army begin to develop their own program to actually settle and negotiate with Charles directly without using Parliament. Now, most of these declarations were written by Henry Ireton in collaboration with the Army Council. So you have, for example, the solemn engagement, and you have a representation of a humble representation of the army. Now, in the representation of the army, there's a very famous quote where the army declared it was not a mere mercenary army, but had been called forward to defend their own and the people's just rights and liberties. So this is a direct response to that sort of accusation from Hulls that they were enemies of the state and disturbers of the public peace. They said, look, we're not mercenary soldiers, right? We are religiously, politically motivated volunteers who took up arms to fight for the people and their rights. And in some ways, they're sort of setting themselves up as a more legitimate authority than Parliament, which is what the political Presbyterians were most concerned by, right? The idea that the New Model Army came to see themselves as more representative of the ordinary English people than Parliament. And it's important to bear in mind with that, right, that we've seen that Parliament itself is not like today, right? Parliament was only elected by the top few percentages of the population who had enough property to vote. So the New Model Army are in some ways making a claim here that they are in some ways more representative of the ordinary people than Parliament itself. So a revolutionary situation in some ways, a situation of what historians sometimes call dual power, right? One where there are almost two seats of authority rather than one, and it's not entirely clear who's actually in charge, right? So you have the Parliament is one source of power, but then this is the New Model Army now actually making its own claim to, in lots of ways, being more representative of the ordinary citizens of the nation. Now, what they demand in this representation of the army, their sort of first set of demands, is they want the Presbyterian MPs purged from Parliament. So that means removed from Parliament. They want to have fixed Parliament, so ones that are elected regularly, and they want to have the right to petition Parliament for change, and also they wanted the guarantee of greater religious freedom than the Presbyterian church settlement would have guaranteed them. So these are their early initial demands. Now, at the end of July, they developed their more sort of formal proposals that they actually begin to negotiate directly with Charles. Okay, so this is Ireton and Cromwell negotiating directly with Charles. Okay, and these become known as the heads of the proposals. So these are the leaders of the army negotiating with Charles directly. And actually, the heads of the proposals were actually surprisingly moderate, and it actually created a growing division actually between the army leaders and grandees like Ireton and Cromwell and the ordinary agitator soldiers of the lower ranks, because they offered him surprisingly generous moderate terms. So they offered him biennial parliament, so not that different to the Triennial Act, just every 2 years instead of every 3. They wanted the equalisation of parliamentary constituencies. Now that was to do with the fact that the MP, where the parliamentary seats were, was still based upon the old medieval constituency boundaries. And what that meant was that you had some seats where there would only be, say, 2 or 3 voters who voted for an MP. You'd have other areas where there would be 10,000 voters, and you'd have some areas that didn't even have any kind of MP. So they wanted to equalize that to make sure that actually, roughly speaking, there were equal numbers of voters in each seat, so that it was more democratic, basically. They wanted parliamentary control of the army and navy for the foreseeable future. They surprisingly agreed to having a national church, so with episcopacy, so a church with bishops, a national church. The only thing that they wanted to change was that the national church wouldn't have powers of coercion or uniformity. So the idea would be that most people would still be part of a national church of England. The only difference would be that people who wanted to have their own independent Congregationalist churches wouldn't be punished by the state. So they would be tolerant of Protestants outside of a national church, but they would allow a national church with bishops to carry on existing, which is quite surprising considering that most of them were kind of Calvinist Puritan radicals. They would agree to that, and they also agreed to an Act of Oblivion, which basically would have pardoned all of the royalists except for a few of the top leaders and generals. Obviously, not Charles. Charles would be pardoned. Now, Charles, even though these terms are really the best ones that Charles gets that were realistically going to be passed, he again has this tactic of playing for time and waiting for divisions to emerge. So even though these proposals are very generous, his advisors urged him to accept the terms Cromwell's offering. He rejected them, or at least he played for time and sort of wasn't very committal. And the the way that backfired is that actually really radicalized a lot of the army, and that's what Charles's advisors like Berkeley recognized. They basically told him, "Look, accept these terms because Cromwell and Ireton have really gone out of their way here to offer you the most moderate terms possible, to the point where they're alienating a lot of their own soldiers. And if you don't accept them, I am worried about what's going to come next because his negotiators could see that there was this breach opening up between the army grandees and the army agitators. And they basically said, look, you're going to radicalize the army, and maybe they're going to do away with wanting to negotiate with you if you don't accept these terms." So again, Charles is playing for time and waiting for these divisions to outbreak, but he did probably come to regret that later on. Now, what then happens after that is while these negotiations are taking place between the army and the army leaders and Charles, is the political Presbyterians in London start to fight back. So Denzil Hollis supports this mob invading Parliament, where they force the MPs there to pass a resolution inviting the king to come to London to negotiate with Parliament instead of the army. So this is a kind of coup. And most of the independent MPs in Parliament, that minority of MPs who supported the New Model Army and the religious independents, they actually fled from Parliament because of this mob, fearing for their lives, and they went to join the army, which was meeting at Newmarket, just outside of London. Now, the army then decides to respond to this Presbyterian mob attack on Parliament by eventually occupying London and forcing the return of these deposed independent MPs, so forcing them to come back into Parliament. Now, we're going to look at this more in the next lecture about what then happened. But basically, after that occupation of London in August 1647, the army then basically has a major series of debates at Putney in southwest London, where the rank and file of the army negotiate with the army grandees what a long-term settlement would actually look like to force onto Charles. So the Putney debates, so these are really, really famous. This is the sort of high point of the levelers and the most radical strain of the agitators in the army coming to the fore. But while those negotiations are taking place at Putney after the New Model Army capture London, Charles escapes from Hampton Court, bringing the negotiations to an end. So, 11th of November 1647, Charles manages to escape from Hampton Court, where he's being held in custody by the army. And as a result, the divisions that had opened up between the army grandees and the army agitators basically closed because they are recognizing that Charles having escaped now represents a major threat. So the divisions that had opened up over what kind of country were, the New Model Army were going to create, those are put to one side because they recognized that with Charles escaping, this was a major threat. And this was exacerbated by the next month in December 1647, Charles goes down to the Isle of Wight, and he negotiates a deal with the Scottish Covenanters known as the Engagement. Okay. Now, what the Engagement basically did was the Scottish Presbyterians were really angry because they did not like the rise of these religiously tolerant independents in the Parliament and the army, because they obviously felt like it was, a betrayal of the deal they'd negotiated with John Pym during the First Civil War. Right? They didn't like the fact that Cromwell was talking about religious liberty and a national church that allowed, religious dissent, because they felt that that was not what they agreed to when they fought the First Civil War. So what the Engagers agreed to was they agreed to invade England on Charles's behalf in exchange for him introducing Presbyterianism into England for 3 years. So again, basically offering Charles the same deal that they'd offered Pym Parliament during the Civil War. So they agreed to invade England, effectively triggering a second civil war, but this time with the Scots on the side of Charles. Now, the effect of Charles's escape and the creation of, this royalist uprising in the Second Civil War, it radicalizes the army even further. Now, the first thing that happens in January 1648, shortly after Charles negotiates the engagement, is you get the passing of what's called the Vote of No Addresses. Now, essentially, what the Vote of No Addresses did was it said that there won't be any more negotiations with Charles. Okay, so this is them sort of burning their bridges with Charles, that, he's not someone who can clearly be negotiated with at this point. Now, there was also then a very famous meeting a few months later, once the Second Civil War starts, at Windsor, amongst the New Model Army commanders and soldiers before they go into battle. So at this prayer meeting, there's this famous biblical passage from 35-33, which you can see over here, which is basically used by the army preachers to describe Charles as being a man of blood, who should be dealt with as such. Now, the essential point of this quote from the Bible is that if the land has been polluted by someone who spilled blood, the only way to purify it is to spill the blood of that man. So the implication was that this is the reason this is a turning point is this is the first time that the New Model Army are seriously suggesting regicide. Okay, remember regicide meaning to kill a royal. Okay, so this is the first time they are debating seriously executing Charles instead of negotiating with him. So that shows you how much the Second Civil War has really begun to radicalize opinion within the ranks of the New Model Army, that they are now seriously considering regicide, the killing of the king. Now, the Second Civil War itself is not anywhere near as bloody or long as the First Civil War. So the First Civil War goes on for nearly 4 years. The Second Civil War is really an 8 or 9 month series of local uprising, followed by this invasion by the Scottish. Okay. Now, the first part of the Second Civil War then is you get this series of coordinated royalist uprisings in places like Essex and Kent, but also particularly in South Wales. Okay, so areas that actually hadn't really seen much fighting during the First Civil War. One reason why historians speculated they were more willing to rise up, they hadn't actually seen the full impact that the Civil War had in other areas, so they were more willing to rise up and fight Parliament. Now, what kind of happens that makes them easy to defeat is basically Cromwell and different branches of the New Model Army basically, first of all, go on this series of mopping up operations where they basically crush these uprisings one by one in Kent and in South Wales. And then the New Model Army basically, after crushing these local uprisings in southeastern England and South Wales, they then march north together to meet the main invading Scottish force at the Battle of Preston. Okay, so this is the main key battle of the Second Civil War. Now, the New Model Army were actually outnumbered during this battle. So it was made up of a very large Scottish royalist army, but then also joined by some local English northeastern royalists who joined them as well. Now, the New Model Army was outnumbered at Preston, but they still won. And really, after the Battle of Preston, it's really just mopping up for the next couple of months after that. Once the Battle of Preston is won, that is really the breaking of the royalist cause of the Second Civil War. Now, Cromwell is the key parliamentary army leader in that battle. And he won a lot of plaudits for winning that. And really importantly, it further increased the army's sense of divine providence, right? They've been outnumbered at Preston, and they'd won against the odds once again. So it increased that sense that, look, God must clearly be on our side and not Charles's. The fact that we've won not just the First Civil War, but also the second one at Preston. Now, so the Second Civil War finishes then, and where does that kind of leave the country? Okay, so Charles is defeated once again, but the key thing now is that the New Model Army especially has become even more radicalized by the experience of the war, and with an even stronger sense of religious mission, right? They've got this even stronger sense of divine providence being on their side. The other thing is that the Second Civil War really brutalizes them. They are less willing to compromise with Charles or royalism, right? They felt like, look, we tried after defeating him to negotiate. We offered him incredibly moderate terms, and all he did was betray us and negotiate in bad faith. So there is a much sort of more cynical attitude towards the royalists and Charles, and there's a lot more brutality as well. People are much more willing to be ruthless with the royalists now. One symbol of that is the fact that when the New Model Army captured Colchester, which was the key royalist stronghold at Colchester in Essex, they basically execute all of the leading royalist commanders and lieutenants. So they don't even put them on trial, they just execute them. So it showed that the kind of brutality of the New Model Army in the face of Charles's escape and triggering of the Second Civil War had become much more serious. Now, Parliament at the end of the Second Civil War is still numerically dominated by political Presbyterian MPs who want to negotiate a kind of settlement with Charles still. But obviously, as you can probably imagine, the New Model Army was not in the mood for that anymore. They described Charles as a man of blood, and as far as they were concerned, he proved that he couldn't be trusted with any kind of negotiating responsibility. So this division between Parliament and the army becomes even more pronounced at the end of the Second Civil War because the New Model Army are no longer willing to negotiate with Charles on any terms. And the idea of regicide becomes much more popular within the rank and file of the army. Now, as we'll see in the trial and execution of Charles I, the way that this division between the army and Parliament is ultimately resolved is the army purged the Parliament of the Presbyterian MPs, so there's only independent supporting MPs who support the New Model Army in Parliament, and then that Parliament, what becomes known as the Rump Parliament, the leftovers, that Parliament is the one that carries out the trial and execution of Charles, largely on behalf of the army. Okay, so yeah. Anyway, at the end of the Second Civil War, then that's the sort of the score. Okay, now guys, now that you've watched this, what I'd like you to do is two things. The first thing is that you've got a little quiz I've attached on Show My Homework. So now that you've watched this, I want you to now go and do that quiz. Just a multiple choice one, just to consolidate some of your knowledge from the lecture, make sure any ones you get wrong that you practice. The second thing I'd like you to do for Wednesday is I've also created an interpretations question. Now, these two extracts are in the book. They're extracts 1 and 2 from the Second Civil War chapter, but I have changed the question. So it is not the question in the textbook, and you're not using extract 3. So it's just these two here. I'll attach this as a document in the description of the YouTube video, but also on Show My Homework. So for Wednesday, 3 p.m., I want you to have completed that Show My Homework quiz and also to have submitted a full draft answer to this extract question, okay, on extracts 1 and 2. I'll put a link on Show My Homework as well to that little video reminding you on how to structure an answer to the extract question, okay? So, you should have done 3 things. Watch this lecture, complete the multiple choice quiz on Show My Homework, and then do this extract question for Wednesday, okay? Now, I'm not going to go through these extracts, okay? I want you to have a go at doing these on your own. Remember to use lots of specific knowledge. You've got the knowledge organizer as well. That might be useful. Oh, and one final thing. I'll also attach and Show My Homework as an extension. I would also strongly recommend watching the Keith Wrightson lecture on this section of the course. Okay, it's only the first 27 minutes of it, but it's really, really good for the next 2 or 3 chapters. Okay, so you got your quiz, got your extract question to do, and as an extension you can also have a look at that Keith Wrightson lecture. Okay, I will put up some more work on Wednesday. Okay, I hope you found that useful, year 12. Email me if you've got any concerns or questions about any of the content.